Hello, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural Food for Thought seminar. I am Vasilis Koutifaris, and on behalf of the Nina Gheihman Center for European Studies, we're very excited to initiate this seminar series in lieu of our usual Friday lunches that we had the opportunity to gather students and fellows and visitors of Harvard at the Center for European Studies. We are particularly excited because today we bring together Albana and Nina, one of our current visiting scholars, and Nina, one of our former PhD candidates and recent alums, who's currently working on a book. Thank you both for agreeing to join us. And Albana, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Vasilis. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this inaugural session of the Food for Thought seminar organized by the Center for European Studies. I'm Albana Shehaj. I am a visiting scholar at CES, and I will be serving as the host of today's event on behalf of the Center for European Studies. To our presenters and to our presenter and all of our attendees, thank you very much for joining us today. It is my pleasure to welcome to you Nina Gheihman, who is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the the Sustainable Food Initiative at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. Nina's book manuscript titled How It All Began builds up on her fieldwork and approximately 150 interviews conducted during her dissertation research in sociology at Harvard University. The book provides a behind-the-scenes account of how veganism transformed from a niche subculture into a mainstream juggernaut. In addition to her book, Nina's work has been featured in a number of media outlets, including Refinery 29, The Telegraph, The Atlantic, the Harvard Gazette, Harvard Magazine, and the Cambridge Forum. The format of this talk today will be such that we will allow the author to present for approximately 20 minutes, at which point we will open the floor for conversations and thoughts on her work. If you have any questions, I invite you to submit them under the Q&A button, and we will be collecting them and present them to the author at the end of the talk. As a side note, and consider this an invitation, I have seen Nina's slides, and some of them can be rather appetizing. So I'm hoping that at the very least you have in front of you a cup of coffee or tea as we hear Nina take us into the exploration of the conditions under which veganism gains momentum and becomes mainstream lifestyle in a given society. On that note, Nina, welcome. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Albana, and it's very nice to be here. I was just starting to really miss Harvard a few months after graduating, so it was very nice to be brought back. So I'll be presenting today, as Albana mentioned, on my dissertation work, specifically the chapter that compares veganism in different places, and I'll be focusing on comparing the US with France today. And as Albana mentioned, I'm working now on a trade book. So not really an academic work, more of a sort of popular audience book. And so I'd welcome any questions that people might have. It's a topic that elicits a lot of questions usually. So I'm very curious to hear what the audience has to say. So I'll be sharing my screen now. Okay. So the title today is Crossing the Cultural Chasm, Comparing Veganism in the United States and France. So when you think of the term vegan, you might have an image like this one. This is from Woody Allen's film Annie Hall in 1977, where he goes to a restaurant called The Source and he orders the alfalfa sprouts and mashed yeast. So we have this kind of idea of the vegan as kind of a hippie, somebody wearing kind of dowdy, earthy toned clothing. Or perhaps you might have an image of an animal rights protester on the street, protesting vivisection, or kind of a PETA activist, someone like that. So this is the image from the 1970s. And fast forward 50 years, and this is Cafe Gratitude. This is a restaurant and cafe that's just down the street from this former restaurant, The Source. And here we see a very different image of veganism. So very high-end marble countertops, serving, kale juices that are $10 a pop, matcha lattes and kale Caesar salads. And, the people who are there are usually very manicured, very high end. So we have this kind of shift in the last 50 years from this kind of marginal image, something on the fringe, to something that's much more mainstream. And more importantly, something that is more high end and more desirable. And indeed, there's been an astronomical growth in vegans from 1 to 2% in 2012 to 3 to 6 in 2019. So something really has been shifting, especially in the last few years. And more importantly, there's been a growth in what we're calling flexitarians. So those are people who are eating less meat, and specifically among younger generations, so the millennials, the Gen Z and Gen X, who are eating mostly plant-based. So about a quarter of young people are eating much more plant-based on a regular basis. And we also see a growth in the plant-based foods market. So a growth of 11% in 2019 compared to 2% for the total retail food market. So specifically this subsection of the retail food market is growing exponentially. And even we see this that during COVID, during the peak buying, panic buying, there was a huge increase in the buying of plant-based meats, for example, Beyond Meat or Impossible and things like that. So this brings up the question, how did veganism become mainstream? And by mainstream, I don't necessarily mean that everybody's becoming vegan, but that mostly that it's becoming a cultural practice that is accepted and normalized in society. You know, you might have a cousin who's vegan or somebody who watched a documentary who's now eating more plant-based. And this is exactly the question. How is it that really in the last 5 years, it's about become mainstream? So this is the question that I answered in my dissertation in 6 chapters. And today I'll be focusing on specifically comparing veganism, a cultural practice around the world, and what can we learn from that comparison. So just to give you some background, the term vegan was coined in 1944 by a man named Donald Watson in England. And what he did is he combined the first and the last parts of the word vegetarian, and he kind of combined 3 different cultural threads that have been kind of separate throughout history, which I term healthism, environmentalism, and speciesism. So while healthism is concerned with the body and with well-being, environmentalism is concerned with the sanctity of the planet, and speciesism, you can think of it as a term that's like, you know, discrimination based on racism or sexism. It's discrimination based on species membership. So when he coined that term, he brought together these 3 threads throughout history. And, you know, he coined this term to specifically denote a lifestyle practice that excludes the consumption of animals and animal products as well. So including dairy and eggs. And so that term was coined in 1944, but what we see in the 1970s is the rise of animal rights. And so this is a social movement that gained momentum. And so basically speciesism, or the concern with the ethical treatment of animals, becomes more dominant in the 1970s. And what we see now is a return to veganism in terms of its expansion of incorporating other meanings, and also the rise of plant-based. So it's a little bit of a complicated timeline, because basically in the 1970s, animal rights becomes dominant. And what we see now is as kind of an expansion of the meaning of the term vegan. And part of what I argue of what's happening now is that veganism is transforming from something that was considered to be part of the animal rights movement, so part of the social movement that is animal rights, and it's becoming distinct. It's becoming its own lifestyle movement. So in this lifestyle movement, it's not so much political action or collective protest that's driving the social change, but it's more economic action and individual consumption. And most specifically, the change agents that are leading the change are not social activists in the traditional sense that we see in social movements, but what I term cultural entrepreneurs. So this is a term that I borrow from the organizational literature. And cultural entrepreneurs are actors that draw upon cultural resources, so discourse, language, categories, logics, and other symbolic evidence elements to advance entrepreneurship. And in this sense, entrepreneurship doesn't just refer to, you know, starting a company, but it actually means changing culture. So being entrepreneurial in terms of innovating culture itself. And what I do is I apply this term to the social movements literature. And I argue that cultural entrepreneurs are the key to why veganism has mainstreamed, because they transformed it from an animal rights social movement into a consumption-based lifestyle movement. And what I do is I talk about these 3 types of cultural entrepreneurs. So the icons are the people who've changed the image of veganism. The informers are the people who've changed the knowledge around veganism. And finally, the innovators are the market entrepreneurs. So just to give you kind of a brief overview, icons might be athletes, chefs, celebrities, or influencers who have transformed veganism into something that is more kind of high-end, so aesthetically something that's desirable. Informers are doctors, filmmakers, and scientists who have kind of given people more knowledge around why adopting a plant-based diet might be beneficial for their health or for the planet, for example. And then innovators are the founders of companies, CEOs, and investors who have actually created new industries, so plant-based and specifically cellular agriculture. So if you've heard of lab-grown meat, that's what cellular agriculture is. So that's just the background on the 3 I's. And so when we talk about mainstreaming, a classic theory is Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovations theory. And he basically offers an explanation of how an innovation evolves from the early adopters to the mainstream. So he says at first there's the innovators, then there's a few more people who adopt it, and then there's the early majority. And Jeffrey Moore is a marketing researcher who wrote an influential book where he argued that basically there's a chasm between the early adopters and the early majority. And that's because the early adopters are visionaries and the early majority are pragmatists, and that they have very different expectations around innovations. And so he offers advice to companies about how to cross the chasm. So he says, choose a target market, position the product, and build a marketing strategy. And he basically says that, like, if a company can pass through this chasm, then they are actually able to innovate and enter the mainstream. But both of these theories are more about either the innovation itself or about how individuals perceive it, rather than sort of thinking about the cultural context in which adoption occurs. So in cultural sociology, we cannot just look at the product itself, but always have to situate it within a given setting. So in my book, in my dissertation and in my book, I basically asked the question of what is it about the cultural context in which adoption occurs? And I argue essentially that the US and France offer an ideal contrast in terms of the national context that provide openings for and barriers to diffusion, in this case, of this innovation, which is veganism, this cultural practice. So we'll be using these cultural case studies to examine under what cultural conditions a cultural practice spreads. So traditional theories of national context have argued things like, that it's the cultural traits of the country or the character of the people, which kind of homogenizes populations. And that, that is limited because it's not like, all the French are a certain way or all the Americans are in a certain way. And culture doesn't work in that way. In fact, culture is much more heterogeneous. And so what we see is that despite the forces of globalization and the spread of veganism around the world, national differences remain and global cultural practices take on nationally specific forms. And so, as I said, it's important to situate this kind of idea of mainstreaming within particular context and see the conditions of each country and how those influence whether a practice is adopted. So as I said, I'll be looking at the US and France. And some of the dimensions of national context include the political context, the economic context. So, how widespread is the entrepreneurial landscape? Are people able to get venture funds to start companies, for example? What is the bureaucracy like? Institutional conditions. So are there protections for ideas of cultural heritage? What are the dietary recommendations? What are the certain institutional loopholes or so the barriers that people have to get through in terms of institutions? And then also the cultural repertoire. So what kinds of myths are there, the narratives and the frames that inform national identity? And in particular, food is extremely salient when it comes to national identity. And then another thing to consider also is how, because veganism was associated with animal rights for so long, it's also important to think about how the animal rights movement has influenced the sort of perception of veganism as well in each country. So let's start with the US. And what I argue essentially is that veganism is now becoming distinct as its own lifestyle movement that is separate from animal rights in the US. And this is most clear in the US. So while animal rights is a social movement that is concerned both with speciesism and environmentalism, and then plant-based is a food tribe. So if you think about something like keto or paleo, those are also food tribes where people kind of identify with certain ways of eating. And those are mostly concerned with health and with the environment. And what veganism is a lifestyle movement that combines all of those 3 elements. So it intersects with the other 2, but it's its own distinct lifestyle movement. And as I mentioned, the icons in the US in particular have been highly influential. So for example, in 2015, the New York Times wrote an article called Vegans Go Glam. And it talked about how influential vegans were laboring to supplant the dowdy image of veganism with a new look that is glamorous, prosperous, sexy, and epidermally beaming with health. So we see icons as, highly important in kind of glamorizing veganism. We also see informers that have been highly influential. So for example, films like The Game Changers, which you might have seen on Netflix, it was the highest, I think it was the most pre-ordered film on iTunes, I believe, before it came out last year around this time. So this has been highly influential, or the documentary Forks Over Knives, or What the Health, Cowspiracy, and so on. So these informers have been very influential as well. And then finally, it's been the site of a lot of innovation. So out of Silicon Valley, we see companies like Beyond Meat or Impossible. And we also see the other industries I mentioned of cellular meat as well. So in the United States, even though there are strong lobbies that support subsidized foods in schools that are animal-based, at the same time, there's a ripe landscape for venture capital innovation. So we see a lot of accelerators. And for a long time, activists were trying to fight the system and kind of go against either the government or go against companies. And what we see now more is this kind of more pragmatic approach in which former activists are becoming cultural entrepreneurs, and they're actually working through the system. So they're working with meat companies. So we see large meat companies investing in plant-based technology. So even though there was kind of this disruption logic to begin with, now there's this kind of like cooperation through capitalism logic. It's also a place that has a long tradition of healthy eating as well as processed food. So it's kind of like these extremes in the US. And in terms of the way that the vegan movement is thinking about it now, is that instead of trying to kind of convince people to not eat animal products, essentially these cultural entrepreneurs are just creating the same products that are basically processed food as well, but they're plant-based. And so it allows people to kind of have their burger and eat it too. It's just that it's the plant-based version. And so this is a very different logic than trying to kind of raise consciousness. They're also getting a lot of support from celebrities and the professional class. And also the animal rights movement has become a lot more pragmatic in the US. So it's developed over time into this kind of entrepreneurial sphere, and it's much more of this collaboration logic rather than a sort of competition or contestation logic. Okay, so let's look at France for a contrast. So we can all think of France as the land of, cheese and meat and bread. And as somebody who used to live in France and absolutely loved cheese, this was before I was vegan, it really is the place to have a very gourmet experience, which definitely includes a lot of animal products. So having lived there, not the most vegetarian and vegan friendly, though that is changing as I'll show. And so what I argue is that in France, actually, the animal rights and the vegan movements are much more tightly coupled. So, to be a vegan and to be an animal rights person are almost one and the same. Like it's sort of hard to be vegan without also being somebody who's doing it for the ethical reasons specifically. And meanwhile, the plant-based dietary tribe, there are definitely people who identify as plant-based. In French, they say végétalien, but they say je suis vegan, pas végétalien, or je suis végétalien, je suis pas vegan, meaning like I'm plant-based, I'm not vegan. So they really, whereas in the US, it's much more fuzzy. It's like you're plant-based, you're vegan. Who knows if, it's much more fluid, much more kind of open. The boundaries are a lot more fluid. Whereas in France, it's a much more kind of like a moralistic boundary that is drawn between those two. And so just to give you a little bit of background, back in 2001, a famous chef called Alain Passard decided to change his 3-star Michelin restaurant, L'Arpège, basically he made it vegetarian. This was 2001, so he was definitely ahead of his time, and it created an absolute uproar in France. And if you're curious about that story, there's an episode of Chef's Table about him, and it's very interesting. And it's just sort of, he was trying to kind of change the sort of French psyche that the center of the plate doesn't necessarily have to be meat, and that created a huge backlash. And we still see this today as early as, as most recently as 2015, in this kind of, there's a Ministère des Affaires Sociales, so the sort of health ministry, had a guide, and it literally says following a plant-based diet over the long term can cause health risks, especially for children. So this is a much more kind of direct denunciation of following a plant-based diet than we see in the US. And this is changing a little bit. I just saw a study the other day that actually came out of France, and they said that it could be healthy, but there's much more of a resistance to it. Meanwhile, the AR movement in France is much more moralistic. So L214, which is L214, is the main group. And they've been incredibly influential in terms of they found undercover footage, for example, of treatment of animals on factory farms, and that's created lots of splashes on like major newspapers like Le Monde, but they're very kind of polarizing. So a lot of people respond not very well to them, and then others think they're heroes that are sort of exposing how animals are treated. And there's this kind of raising of consciousness in France. But what that's led to is, rather than sort of this kind of trying to get people to consume more plant-based, it's more of these kind of intellectual and moralistic debates. So for example, there was a few people who vandalized butcher shops, and Catherine Helal, who is the co-secretary of the Animal Party in France, came on their show and said basically that it wasn't about what you were consuming, it was about you had to do it in this sort of ethical way. And it was a philosophical debate about veganism not as a lifestyle choice, but really about kind of this moralistic concern around animals. And what we see is a backlash as well. So Jean-François Guillard, who's the head of the French Federation of Butchers, about these kind of the vandalism of the butcher shop, said, "It's a terror that these people are seeking to sow. It's their aim to make a whole section of French culture disappear. Vegans want to impose their lifestyle and even their ideology on the immense majority of people," which is exactly what a lot of vegans want to do. But it's framed in France as this kind of attack on French culture, and what will France be without its meat and its dairy. And Olivier Poel, this man here, said, "Imagine the world we would be in, a world without meat, without cheese. There are no farms, there are no traditions. We will need to throw out thousands of years of culture. French gastronomy will disappear." So what is happening here is that this is seen as attack on what Michele De Soucy has called gastronationalism. So for the US, this sort of idea of food, it doesn't really sort of affect the culture in the same way that it does in France, because in the US, doesn't really have a food culture. It's kind of like fast food and maybe health food is the food culture. Whereas in France, the gastronomy is one of its most central kind of tenets. And so veganism definitely challenges it. And so we see a backlash of activists, also like this woman here who's wearing a shirt that says, "Donne du porc à ton corps," so give pork to your body. And also this critique of veganism as here in this article, the useful idiots of capitalism. So there's this kind of rhetoric of anti-capitalism as well. And so in France, we see that there are, like in the US, strong, but possibly even stronger food lobbies that protect farmers. They also have a huge influence on what's served in school canteens. So for example, vegetarianism was banned in school canteens in 2011. So it's very difficult to bring like your own lunch, or let's say, you have a vegan child, they can't really eat vegan at school. So there's this kind of anti-capitalistic and anti-American national sentiment. There's also, so gastronomy is the salient component of Frenchness, and national dishes nearly all are animal-based. So the foie gras, fromage. There are institutional protections actually for cultural heritage and for regional products. And there's this sort of notion in France of the agrarian France. So even though actually a lot of animal products in France are actually made on factory farms, most people don't think that's where their products come from. They really have this vision of sort of French agrarian culture. And as I said, even the movement within France is much more kind of militaristic and moralistic. So you have to sort of become vegan, you have to become 100% vegan, and you have to do it for the right reasons, which means animal rights, rather than in the US, where it's much more fluid and people are much more comfortable with people doing it for lots of different reasons. And there's still this kind of association with cult and with extremism in France. So some of those are barriers to diffusion. So what we see is that in France, at best, veganism is sort of in the early adoption phase. The US possibly is right at the beginning of the early majority phase. And so what we see is that France is still kind of facing this chasm, which I think the US has, either already passed through or is close to passing through that chasm. So this is just kind of like a summary of the two different contexts, but I can return to that later if we have questions. At the same time, in France, capitalism still marches on because it is a global phenomenon. So we see that Veggie World Paris is one of the largest in the world. This is a vegetarian festival, a vegan festival. There's a whole chain of entirely vegan and organic stores, Naturalia, and even high-end restaurants like the Shangri-La in Paris is creating a vegan high tea. And I spoke to the chef there, the pastry chef, Michael Bertosetti, and he told me that it is because of the globalizing influence of veganism, in particular, these high-end clients who request vegan food. So basically, capitalism is transforming veganism into a lifestyle movement globally. And despite some of the efforts of, committed activists who might want it to still be more of an animal rights moralistic movement, the growth is not really attributable mostly to moral consciousness raising, although that is a part of it, and people are more aware of factory farms, conditions on factory farms, the influence on the environment, and so on. But a lot of this has to do with the fact that there is a change in the culture of consumption. And in many ways, veganism does resonate with other aspects of French culture. So it's gourmet aestheticism, the back to the land agrarian vision of France is actually very consistent with anti-factory farming rhetoric. And so there's some ways in which actually veganism does resonate with some things that people in France do hold dear. So time will tell if the lifestyle movement approach in France will be successful in pushing it into the mainstream or not, or whether these barriers will be sufficient to kind of holding it back in the fringe. So a key takeaway is that the process of mainstreaming is not a simple story of a cultural practice moving from the margins to the mainstream. It's not just this fluid process, but actually how a cultural practice becomes popularized depends on the conditions of each cultural context. And the cases of the US and France are ideal in contrasting contexts in which to examine the openings for and the barriers to the diffusion of veganism. In this case, a movement that is transforming from a social movement into a lifestyle movement through a logic of consumption. And these cultural entrepreneurs are both, enabled and constrained to some extent by the conditions in which they are situated. So yes, as I said, cultural entrepreneurs are both enabled and constrained, and that the adoption of novel cultural practices depends on the interaction with existing cultural conditions. So it's not just, this chasm that is a challenge for all novel innovations, but that the chasm is always situated within a particular context. So ultimately, global capitalism is likely to increase the pressure for cultural adoption, though not without certain cultural compromises, which I also talk about in my dissertation. I'm happy to answer any questions about what those might be as well. Okay, thank you so much.
Great, Nina, thank you very much for your presentation. I definitely learned a lot more that I knew prior to coming in here, so thank you for that. We have 3 questions from the audience, and I think I would prefer to start with those prior to engaging in a larger conversation of additional thoughts of what you have to say on the topic. So the first question is, do you see any differences between vegans and those who eat whole foods, plant-based diet?
Mm-hmm. So the whole food plant-based diet is a diet that is in the sort of healthism faction of the vegan movement. And so that refers to a diet that is not only plant-based in terms of eliminating animal products, but also no oil, typically no salt and sugar and things like that. So I think that actually within the US, I'm actually surprised to what extent the whole food plant-based camp, which is more the health-oriented camp, and the sort of animal rights camp are different. So I actually think that both are vegan, but they're kind of vegan for different reasons. So the whole food plant-based camp is typically vegan for primarily health reasons, and the animal rights camp is primarily vegan for its ethical reasons around animals. And so I do see actually even in fighting within the movement itself. So for example, on the whole food plant-based side, there's a lot of kind of critique of, for example, companies like Beyond Meat or Impossible, because they're seen as highly processed things, and people just say like, why can't people just eat beans? Whereas on the sort of ethical animal rights side, it's seen as sort of talking about the health is often seen as getting in the way of this broader issue around animal suffering, and that if we create these other alternative products, then actually people will be much more likely to shift. And it is a difficult question because, what's interesting is that, the classic meat alternatives that were created for vegans, and they were typically created for people who also cared about health. And so, they were non-GMO, they were organic, and they were sort of on the fringe. Whereas now the Impossible Burger, for example, is not non-GMO. It does have GMO soy, I believe. And so they're not really targeting the health consumer. They're really targeting the people who really want the taste of meat, and they're creating that taste from plants. And it's not about keeping it healthy. It's really about absolutely replacing and reproducing the taste of meat. And so there is, this kind of a split within the movement. That being said, of course, there's plenty of people who do it for both reasons, but yes, there is typically an ideological difference. And when I say ideological, I don't just mean ethical, because healthism is also a type of ideology. It's just around the sanctity of the body, whereas, the ideology around animals is about the sanctity of life and of animals. So they're different logics, and they sometimes do clash even within the movement.
Great, thank you. So a question by Christina Colburn is, I don't know all of France, but in Lyon, there are at least 9 vegan restaurants in the city. Are they ahead of the cultural curve in France?
Well, actually, I would say that I collected my data in 2017. So that was quite a while ago in the span of veganism, because since 2015, it's just absolutely exploded. So I lived there for 7 summers in a row, I think, between like 2011 and 2017 or something like that. And it was just astronomical. Like, it was like there was nothing, and then suddenly there were like 2, and then suddenly there were 4, and then suddenly there were like 12, especially in Paris. Like, now Paris is actually one of the centers of vegan kind of the restaurant scene. And I'm not surprised at all. Lyon, which is like the gastronomical capital of one of the gastronomical capitals of the world. I think they are a little bit of the curve, but you also have to remember that it is just generally the site of food innovation, even within France. So it's not surprising to me that they would have a lot of restaurants. That being said, it's interesting that within France, entrepreneurship still refers specifically to the opening of restaurants, rather than to kind of entrepreneurship in terms of food products, or really these like big companies that could really compete with the existing incumbents. So I would say that, it is actually shifting quite quickly in France. So despite the backlash, there's still, as I mentioned at the end, a lot of people who are starting to get on the bandwagon. And it also is happening in the major cities, because that's also where people get exposed to the literature, a lot of which is English. And so places where people are more likely to speak English, also it's growing faster.
So the next 2 questions are somehow related, so I will ask them simultaneously. The first one is by Maddie, and her question is factory farming and the horrific conditions in which animals are raised in France as common as it is in the United States? And the other one is, do you know how, by Anna Jacobs, do you know how vegetables versus meat and dairy farmers in France are subsidized, and then in relationship to the US farmers? So if you could speak to those briefly.
So actually, factory farming is quite prevalent in France. This is, I think, a big misconception about France, is that it's sort of this vision of like it's all kind of, local farms and kind of family farms. And it's actually quite significant. It's quite prevalent there. And I think that in terms of subsidies, it works very, very similarly to the US. I actually think that in terms of the relationship with schools, because of the sort of more socialist system in France, and the sort of like stronger presence of just bureaucracy in general, and kind of this more of a socialist system, there is actually more of an influence. Like, I think in the US, it is a little bit more, like the lobbies are really significant in both places, but I think that in the US, there's slightly more variation, even like in terms of schooling and how food works in school, where in France, it really is the case that, you have to have a cheese, course in every kind of school canteen and every work canteen. And even just this notion of a canteen that you eat at school, whereas in the US, a lot of the time, you bring food from home. And so, yeah, I think it is just kind of more, even more present in France. It's more institutionalized. So it's difficult to kind of go against that entrenched system in France.
Great. Thank you. I briefly want to remind the audience that you can either type your question, or you can raise your hand, and Michael will help us in activating your camera, and you can ask your question personally. Thank you. While waiting, Nina, I'll ask the next question by Galina. And this question relates to my own. Or is it? Okay.
Or my sister's name, at least.
Okay.
It's a different Galina.
Should have picked up on that. So are the 3 I's you describe evenly distributed across countries, or do some countries have more or less of one type of cultural entrepreneur? And this relates to my own question, which is, you identify the 3 I's. And I wonder if you can also speak a bit about, because all your 3 I's also have this strong weapon in their hands, and that is the media. So what is it, how do you distinguish that, the role of the relationship between the 3 I's and the media versus the cultural aspect of veganism as a rising power?
Yeah, so that's a great question about my sister. Yes, actually, I think the distribution is different, and that's partly because, I mean, the U.S. of course is a much bigger country, and so there's more people who can kind of have this kind of influence. But part of what I saw, I also looked at Israel in my case, in my dissertation, and what I saw basically is that I saw kind of gaps where people were missing. So back when I did the work in France in 2017, there actually really weren't like icons that you could really think of that were kind of like emblematic of veganism. I think that's changed now. There's like a famous philosopher, there's some kind of social media influencers, but these people have kind of come a little bit later. And so what we do see is that I think part of the lagging that's happening in France is also, lack of the influence of these people. And to your point about the media, I think that they, all 3 of them do have a relationship to the media. I mean, I think that in France, what was mostly missing, which I think is changing now, are actually the icons, because the icons are the people who kind of embody veganism as something that is desirable and aspirational. And that was lacking in France in particular. There wasn't really any like icon that people could say, like they could say in the US, like, I don't know, Billie Eilish, or, most recently Miley Cyrus. I think she's not vegan anymore, but kind of these celebrity people who they could sort of say, like, this is somebody to emulate. And so if you think about the 3 I's, it's almost like the icons kind of create the demand because they create a lifestyle worthy of emulation and desire, and it's sort of desirable. Then the informers, give you the reasons why to do it. And then finally, the innovators create the products and the ability to actually try the lifestyle. And all 3 of them were kind of lacking compared to the US. I think that's changing to some extent now. And in terms of disentangling the media from the culture, I do think that the media is very important. And when you say media, do you mean social media as well, as part of that?
All kinds of media. All
kinds of media. Yeah, so I think that the media is very important, but I think it's also in France, what was partly lacking was the product. So as I mentioned that, in the US, like something having like Beyond Meat or Impossible, it's really good for people who want to sort of argue that you don't really need meat because you have this other option. In France, there really wasn't that. And in a place where people were very much attached to kind of like the taste and the culture around the specific food, if you didn't have like, a piece of cheese to give to someone and prove that like you can make cheese from cashews and that will taste the same way as like brie will taste, then that kind of creates a disconnect. So as important as the media and the sort of creation of the demand and the awareness is important, people also need, in order to adopt new cultural practices, the experiential component. And I think that was missing in part because people just didn't have the resources really to start companies. In France, like there's not the kind of support as in the US for entrepreneurs. There's a lot more bureaucratic hurdles. And so I saw a lot of restaurants that opened and then within a year they were closed. And another thing is that in the US, it's much more professionalized. So in France, a lot of these restaurants were started by activists with like really good intentions and great hearts, but not necessarily business experience. Whereas in the US, there was this much more of an orchestration and a strategizing within the movement of trying to bring people in from, industry who have experience in running a food company and getting it from the idea to the consumer packaged goods. So it's just more highly professionalized in terms of the entrepreneurial landscape.
Thank you. So the next question is by Michelle. And her question is, some people watch movies such as Game Changers, Food Incorporated, etc. However, they are unable to change their eating habits or lifestyles to veganism. How do you explain this irrationality when it is veganism is healthier? First of all, my question to this question is it clear that it is healthier? Mm-hmm. And then you can proceed with the rest of the question.
That sounds like it was asked by somebody who's vegan. Well, so in terms of healthier, actually, I think that there is more and more evidence that it is healthier to eat a plant-based diet. So I think there's a lot of disagreement within the nutritional world. There's kind of a lot of dietary fads and so on, but I do think that the reasonable thing to say is that a plant-based diet that is full of a lot of legumes and whole grains and vegetables and fruits is ideal, whether that includes animal products or not. The closer that one gets to that, I think that that's true. It is healthier. There's less saturated fat. And so on. So of course you can eat, you can be an Oreos and French fries vegan, but if you eat kind of like more healthy food, I think it is actually superior in terms of health. But the answer to that question is quite simple. As a sociologist, food is not something that is, it's not, it's sort of like what we've learned from behavioral economics. People aren't necessarily rational, even if they, understand how their food is created, or even just like other types of consumption that we engage in that's not necessarily the most ethical. Food is always situated within a broader landscape, and our tastes are so related to our histories, our family upbringing and so on. And so we can never think about food choices as simply like idiosyncratic or personal. They're also highly structured by our societies and by our culture. And so even if people might, watch a documentary and feel very strongly about, not eating animals, the next day they're invited to a party where there's something that looks good and it's just habitual, and it's sort of like, oh, I'll just have a little bit, and then they start. And so, they're embedded within a network of other people who are, not primarily vegan. And so this is partly like when I'm arguing about the mainstream, is that it's not just going to be kind of consciousness raising among a select few people who then kind of influence others, even though that's very important because they're embedded in networks that will influence people long-term potentially, but that there needs to actually be a structural change for people to eat in any new way, because currently the way that we eat is highly structured. And so it's not just a matter of like personal choice, but actually it's a much more of structured and cultural decision. And so as much as people may even want to be vegan, we don't live in a vegan world. So it's difficult to be vegan in a world that's the social norms are still in favor of not being vegan. So it's difficult to adopt that diet.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to address this question, which touches on a different angle of your research. And I'm not going in necessarily chronological order. I'm going by topics. So please forgive me if I'm leaving anyone behind. So this question comes from Loredana, and her question is, can you please talk a bit more about your methods and data? Mm-hmm. And what other data have you used beyond surveys? And then her second question, what about veganism as political activism? Have you considered this dimension?
Mm-hmm. So yes, I have considered it as political activism. When I talk about a social movement and veganism as being part, especially of the animal rights movement, that really was kind of a politicized movement. It was against companies, it was against the state. So it was kind of this logic of contesting the existing structure and using methods such as, protesting and leafleting and, ballot measures and so on. So it was very much a politicized movement. What I'm arguing is that now veganism is becoming less politicized and more of consumption-oriented movement. And in terms of my methods, that's a great question. So I did do about 110 interviews in the US, and then 35 in France and 25 in Israel for the dissertation. And I spent about a year doing field work all around the world. And so when I started the project in 2015, I really did not know what to expect. I kind of thought I would be studying basically the tension between activists and entrepreneurs in trying to sort of promote their message. And then what I found that was really surprising is that as I was doing my field work, I discovered that actually a lot of the entrepreneurs I was talking to were former activists that basically thought that, that their efforts were not that successful because after decades, veganism and vegetarianism, they were still like 2% of the population, and people were just not that interested in, raising their consciousness around how food influences the planet and animals and so on. And so what was interesting is doing this field work and doing all these interviews that were kind of a snowball effect. So I kind of talked to one person and then they introduced me to someone else, and it became the snowball effect of kind of the leaders within the vegan movement. Was really that. And that's kind of what the book is about, is that shift within the movement itself.
Thank you. Next question, Nina, is from Eric. And his question is, in the United States, what collective spaces are most open, ready to a shift by vegan individuals coming together to creating more of a plant-based default food choice? Is it schools, hospitals, or somewhere else that you recommend individuals to focus their attention or work?
That's a great question. I think that's a question that's, debated within the movement itself. So I don't know if I have, the definitive answer to that question. I would say that schools is very difficult because there is, there are a lot of lobbies involved. And also when it comes to children, it's just difficult to change systems as they are because there's a lot of concern around nutritional guidelines and so on. And so long as the nutritional guidelines are still quite heavy on meat and dairy, I think that schools would be difficult. I think hospitals actually is a really good place because there is a lot more research about the power of truly healthy plant-based diets to not only prevent but actually reverse disease. So particularly with very sickly populations and with chronic diseases that we know are highly linked to diet. So diabetes, heart disease, and things like that. I think that actually hospitals could be a great place. And we do see this around the country, like certain institutional leaders within hospitals are making that shift. But I mean, all of the attention right now is definitely going toward companies and working with, existing, it's actually interesting because the approach really isn't, at first it was kind of disrupting the existing industry, and now it's really working with industry incumbents and getting the Cargills and the Tysons of the world to invest and to be part of this movement. So I do think that slowly it's shifting because people kind of at the top in all areas of society are starting to infiltrate a little bit. But I would say hospitals are a great place to start, and companies more broadly, companies I think where there's an alignment of incentives. So for example, like insurance companies, because they're incentivized to have people that are healthier. And so it's actually like a great place to start when you think about like, where are the incentives already aligned for a more healthier, more conscious diet? And in the world of capitalism that we live in, it really is about the alignment of incentives. So something to think about.
Thank you, Nina. The next question is from our very own Elaine Papullas. And Elaine's comment is, this was a terrific talk. I would love to know more about how Nina came to choose this topic for her dissertation, and which findings were the most among the ones that she anticipated. And what is her current research focused on now, and would be happy to talk in person.
In person or on Zoom now. Thank you so much, Elaine. That's a very, very kind comment. So how did I get into this? Well, I, to my own surprise, I ended up doing a dissertation on veganism. I would have never thought that, to be honest. I was vegetarian for a long time, but I was the kind of vegetarian who lived in France and tried every cheese and loved croissants. And if you had told me I'd be vegan, I would be very, very surprised. But what happened essentially is that my grandfather got sick, and then I did watch Forks Over Knives, and then I kind of went into this down a rabbit hole, looking at the link between diet and disease. So while I had become vegetarian mostly for like ethical reasons, I became vegan for health reasons. And then now I think if I were to, re-examine why I'm doing it, it's primarily environmental reasons. So I've kind of like shifted even within my own life. But the reason I decided to do this as a topic is that, to be honest, I felt like I was vegan, but I didn't quite identify with the sort of stereotypes of the vegans. And I was like, well, I don't, feel that marginal, and I want to be part of, the mainstream. So I had this kind of like, how is it that I'm vegan, but I don't identify with a lot of these kind of like stereotypes or image of the vegan? And so I was curious about, I could see that there was a shift, and the companies like Beyond Meat were already existing. And I just was like, how did vegan go from, this image that I have of this kind of like protester to, Ethan Brown getting a bunch of money from a Silicon Valley firm to start Beyond Meat? Like, I just didn't know why suddenly Silicon Valley was investing in food as a new trend. And I was just curious about what happened and who was behind it. And then it was just ended up being this fascinating kind of Alice in Wonderland experience, because I discovered that actually it's quite a small number and cadre of people who are pulling the strings, and, including what I like very lovingly called the vegan mafia that are investing in this space. And I wanted to understand their stories. And what was most shocking in terms of the finding was really what I said earlier, was that it wasn't the activists and then these like new entrepreneurs came to the scene, that a lot of these entrepreneurs were actually former activists that basically came to the conclusion in their own personal life, which included a lot of personal crises, of like I'm standing here on the street giving leaflets out all day and it's having absolutely no impact, or not absolutely no impact, but it was not having the impact that they were hoping for this in terms of consciousness raising. And a lot of them were anti-capitalist. They were squatters, or they were like homelessness activists, or people who were very much, they had their heart in the right place, but they were definitely not tools of capitalism. And then suddenly, they're wearing business suits at conferences and getting money from like traditional investors. And I was just fascinated by that story and that shift. And that's what I wanted to tell, that story. So I'm very excited to actually write the book, because the dissertation was still this academic story of the shift from a certain movement to another. But the book is going to be much more narrative driven. So it's going to be these people's personal lives and stories, and how they actually participated in the shift.
Great. Given that you transitioned into the book, if I could ask a question, which I am going to align with Eva's question, and I'm going to read Eva's first, which is, does veganism become mainstream in all social strata? Do you see any differences between US and France in this sense? And my question to add to this, Nina, would be, what about the demographic aspect of veganism as a concept, or as a lifestyle movement, right? Do you see one? And is that part of your theoretical framework?
Mm-hmm. It's such a good question. I do talk about it a lot in the book, in the dissertation, about social class and social status, because actually there is a difference between how veganism is perceived and then the reality. So for example, the reality is actually that it's primarily women, and primarily actually there's a huge proportion that are minorities. So African Americans, for example, a lot of them are vegan, but the people we see in the limelight, or sort of the leadership of the movement, typically still is still white and Caucasian, and it's primarily men in leadership positions. But I wouldn't necessarily say that that's, a problem within the vegan movement itself. That's just kind of like social inequality in society more generally, writ large. But it's interesting because, the question I often get asked is like, isn't veganism like the thing that people used to eat when they, like, it's the diet that people followed when they didn't have money? And that's true. It used to be associated with kind of the lower classes, people who didn't have a choice as to what to eat, and meat had this very high status. And what's happening now is kind of this flip. It's like the people who have the choice about what to eat, they're actually, the sort of exclusivity becomes around choosing not to eat certain things. So it's typically more educated people and so on. But it does, I think, vary across the socioeconomics ladder, depending on people's motivations. So there are a lot of people who are sort of maybe following a vegan diet because it's cheaper, for example. Like, it's actually more affordable if you eat like beans and rice and things like that, kind of a more of a simple diet. So in terms of like eating the sort of latest sexy, cool products, it's definitely more of a high-end type thing. It's more of a East-West Coast elite type of thing. But more and more, this is why we see the vegan movement trying to make inroads in the middle of the country, and in particular in fast food restaurants, because they see that as the place where they can actually influence. And so again, this is good because, it means less animals are being killed, but it's also, they're still doing it through fast food. So it'd be nice if we could also have more of a healthy mindset when it comes to food. But I'd love to talk more about that topic. It's such a fascinating subject.
The next question is, what national governments have endorsed whole food plant-based in their official dietary guidelines? The new 2019 Canada's Food Guide states that animal food products are not necessary for health, and the Conservative Party, and I'm sure.
So as a proud Canadian, I will say that the Canadian government has actually been quite on board. So they actually do have a plan now, like the Food Guide, that is, I think, entirely plant-based, or like that's an option at least. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to remember, I think maybe there was something about in Asia, I forget exactly where it was, but I think there are, maybe Singapore, there's kind of, I don't think there's any country that's like fully endorsing a whole food plant-based diet. I do think Canada is probably one of the most leading countries, but actually, I mean, this is the problem again of incentives, where sick people are actually, make money because the healthcare industry thrives on people who are not well. And so the incentives are not aligned there. They're actually, hospitals can make more money if people are sick. So there's not really this logic of healthfulness versus disease, like it's very much, I think that if we, I'll say one radical thing. I do think that actually if we did really promote more of a plant-based diet, I think that there could be a significant improvement in chronic disease issues. And I think as soon as like incentives will be aligned, and that will actually be a benefit to countries to realize that like they could have healthier populations, and that could be something that could potentially be beneficial. That's, I think, where we'll see the shift in the needle, where it's like this kind of nudge approach rather than necessarily like, consciousness raising around this moralistic. I think we really need to think about incentives, because in a capitalist system, that's how things shift.
Thank you. I think the next two questions, Nina, touch on some interesting subjects, and we have 4 minutes to go. So this is going to be a very concise kind of reply. So the first one is, what about the relationship between veganism and feminism?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next question is, do you think that the animal rights movement has diminished recently, or has it just become less associated with the mainstream branch of veganism?
Those are great questions. So yeah, there's a long literature and history of associating veganism with feminism and making the argument that basically that the way we kind of put down women and objectify women and so on is also how we kind of put down and objectify animals. And there also, I think, is recently there was kind of some things that came up during the sort of Me Too movement. There was also some revelations that came out in the vegan movement as well around some of the issues with, male leadership in the vegan movement and how some of those issues intersected as well. And so I do think, I think there's a philosophical argument to be made, relating the struggle of animals and the struggle of women and how they're subjugated. And I think there's also just like a social structural argument to be made about gender and equality within the movement. So there's a lot of relationship. There could be a whole dissertation written on that topic, but there's Carol Adams is one of the main thinkers in that field. So if you're curious, that'd be somebody I would read.
Actually, the question asker, Manon, asks that, refers to Carol Adams.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Nina, one final question that is mine, and I reserve my privilege here. So that is about the generalizability of your results. Do you see your case being applicable to other cultures and to other influencer groups, as you call them?
I think the way that I see it as being generalizable is specifically the 3 I's. So I do think that what I've discovered in terms of the components of culture that they were innovating, I think that does apply to other cases. So for example, we think of like environmentalism. I do think that there's not really clear icons in the environmental movement that are kind of promoting it. I mean, now we have, a few activists that are more, more well known, but I think that it is an interesting model to kind of apply to other cases that are not about food or other, basically, I think it's generalizable to other cases of popularization of the move of a cultural practice from the margins to the mainstream. And I think that the 3 I framework could be helpful to sort of thinking about what is missing here or what could be added that could be helpful in terms of mainstreaming. And also just the broader theoretical point of the fact that the mainstreaming process isn't this kind of, devoid of cultural context, that it actually is, part and parcel of the cultural context, and we always have to situate it within those other contexts.
Wonderful. Nina, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. It sounds fascinating. Thank you for being here. And to all the attendees that joined us today, thank you very much for your time. I hope you have enjoyed this first seminar of the Foods for Thought from the Center for European Studies. And stay tuned for additional events organized by CES. Stay tuned to our website or forthcoming emails. Thank you very much, Nina.
Thank you so much, Albana. You're a fantastic moderator, truly.
Thank you. It was a lovely presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a beautiful day, everyone.
You as well.